Welcome back to our next lecture video. This one is on the ethical task. We're going to start out considering that people in different places do things differently. We have an example of how cultures vary from antiquity. Herodotus wrote about King Darius of Persia, and that he once performed kind of an experiment to illustrate the diversity of moral customs, the different things that people did. He had a very large empire, so he brought together two groups of people. There was an Asian tribal people known as the Calaitians, and he brought together some Greeks from Greece, obviously. And he brought them together, and he asked the Calaitians, "What do you do with your dead relatives?" And the Calaitians said, "Well, we do what's proper. We eat them. We consume them." The Greeks got all bent out of shape, and they said, "Whoa, this is terrible. This shouldn't happen." And then Darius asked the Greeks, "What do you do with your dead?" And they said that they cremated them. They burned them. And the Calaitians were saying, "You shouldn't even talk about this kind of thing. That's not what you're supposed to do with your dead." And so Herodotus brings us this report and says that custom is king over all. So even though Darius was king, custom still ruled over parts of his empire. And so the idea that we get from this is that what we find to be normal behavior in one place is not the same everywhere else. So we have the following question: can we make moral judgments? I want you to think about this, and you certainly could pause the video here and leave a response in the discussion board. If you do, note that this is before you had the rest of the lecture, but you can make a discussion post there if you'd like. But think about that. You can pause the video and do that. We'll pick up and move on. You have a concept known as cultural relativism. And cultural relativism is a descriptive term, and what it says is that cultures have different standards by which they judge morality. This is not controversial. We have different expectations of behavior, whether you are in different parts of the country, north or south, east and west. There's different expectations of culture, whether you live, perhaps even if you just live in a rural area or if you live in a city or a very urban area. And if we look at different countries and groups of peoples, we can see different types of practices of what's right or wrong and how they do things. So cultural relativism is something that we see, and that's what Darius has demonstrated, or demonstrated that example with Darius, shows something called cultural relativism. And a related term to that, but very different, is ethical relativism. So cultural relativism describes things. It doesn't say that's how it should be. Ethical relativism, however, is a normative position, and it says that there are no universal objective moral principles binding all people in all times at all places. So ethical relativism is telling us that moral principles are relative to some facet of the people that you're referencing, the time in which they're living, or the place in which they are living. So somehow what is right or wrong, not just what is done, but what is actually right or wrong, depends on time, place, and person. So ethical relativism is different from cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is simply saying different cultures do things differently. Ethical relativism is saying what is right or wrong differs based on place, person, or time. So the next concept that we want to get a little bit looking at is ethical objectivism, and this will be contrasted with ethical relativism. So ethical objectivism says that there are at least some universal objective moral principles that bind all people in all places at all times. So ethical objectivism and ethical relativism are going to be at odds with one another. If one is true, the other is not going to be true. So notice that ethical objectivism doesn't say every moral principle is universal, but there are at least some, and that's why some is in capital letters, some of the moral principles are actually objective in that they bind all people in all times and all places. So some things would always be wrong for any person wherever they are in the world and at any time. Okay, and that would contrast then with ethical relativism. The third concept is ethical nihilism. And this is the claim that there are no moral truths at all. Instead of moral truths being something about reality, they are illusions and they are a power struggle. So if somebody claims this is right or wrong, then what they are doing is performing an attempt to control another person. So these are three different approaches to the concept of ethics. One is that there are objective moral values or principles that apply to everybody everywhere at all times. The other is no, there are moral principles, but they are relative to time, place, and person. And then you have the nihilist position that says moral claims are just a power struggle. Okay? So these are the three approaches that we have. I'm going to bring up now a picture that I've put together for us. So let me see if I can get this to the preview. That's not what I want. Well, we can see the picture. So what I've got over here is ethical relativism, ethical objectivism, and nihilism here. So nihilism is like a pit. There's no meaning. Everything is simply a power struggle. And this is something that kind of resembles a ladder. So what I want us to keep in mind, and I'll try to adjust this picture as we go through the semester. Normally I just draw this on the board, but since we don't have a board to do that in, I'm having to do that here. So we're going to look at a couple of approaches to ethical relativism, and these would be these top two rungs of the ladder here. So think of this as a ladder, and this is a pit. This ladder is keeping you out of this pit of nihilism. We're going to look at a couple approaches that are objective, ethical objectivist approaches. Okay, and so we've got some other rungs. And so over the course of the semester, we hope that one of these rungs will be able to hold us out of this pit of nihilism. So that's what we're going to do. We'll come back to this and we'll fill in some of these rungs as we talk about them. But that's going to be our task for the remainder of this class, is trying to fill out these different approaches to ethics and seeing if we can avoid the despair that comes with nihilism at the end. So the first one we're going to look at is we're going to look at a couple of approaches that are ethical relativism. And we have a quote from John Ladd from his book, Ethical Relativism, in 1973. And he writes, "Ethical relativism is the doctrine that the moral rightness or wrongness of actions varies from society, and that there are no absolute universal moral standards binding on all men at all times. Accordingly, it holds that whether or not it is right for an individual to act in a certain way depends on, or is relative to, the society to which he belongs." So, nothing is applicable to every person at all times and all places. It's all relative to their society and some aspect of that. So this is the concept of ethical relativism. So this is, just kind of confirming what we have said. Within this concept, there's going to be two theses that you need to at least have an understanding of. The first is the diversity thesis. This is related to the cultural relativism aspect. Again, cultural relativism is simply descriptive. It's not telling us what ought to be. It's simply just saying this is the case. So the diversity thesis says moral rules differ from society to society. And if we flip back to cultural relativism, cultures have different standards by which they judge morality. So we can say, okay, yeah, these two are related. It's non-controversial. People do things differently in different places. Okay? The dependency thesis is a little bit different, though, because it fits with ethical relativism and says individual acts are right or wrong depending on the nature of the society in which they occur. So what makes something right or wrong is the nature of the society in which those acts happen. So what could be right in one culture, it could be wrong in another culture. Okay? And now we're not talking proper or improper, that it's just what they do. We're talking about actually morally right or wrong, depending on the culture. So the dependency thesis is related to ethical relativism, while the diversity thesis is related to cultural relativism. So just keep that in mind. Now, the first of the rungs on this ladder, and let's see if we can go back and maybe fill in the ladder here. See if I can insert a text box. Okay, the first rung on our ladder, subjective ethical relativism. All right, so it fits here as this first rung that we're going to look at. Let's get back to our presentation. So, subjective ethical relativism. Morality depends on the individual culture. And subjective, just when we're talking, this is going to have some similarities to our discussion on understanding truth. Okay, subjective ethical relativism, the subject is going to be what is the place where right or wrong is determined. Okay, the subject. So subjective ethical relativism, the individual in the culture is the one who's going to make that determination. So let's look at this quote from Ernest Hemingway from his book, The Death in the Afternoon, from 1932. So far about morals, I only know what is moral is what you feel good after, and what is immoral is what you feel bad after. And judged by these moral standards, which I do not defend, the bullfight is very moral to me because I feel very fine while it is going on, and I have a feeling of life and death and mortality and immortality, and after it is all over, I feel very sad but very fine. So, this Death in the Afternoon is a description of a bullfight, and of course in a bullfight you have a matador who faces off against a bull, and very stylistically he ends up killing the bull at the end of the fight. And so, for Hemingway to say that what is right or wrong is how you determine what's right or wrong, for Hemingway, he says, what's right is what you feel good after, and what's wrong is what you feel bad after. So, the subject determines what is right or what is wrong in subjective ethical relativism. So, if we talk about subjective ethical relativism, each individual person would determine right or wrong. And it could be using Ernest Hemingway's approach, that it's what you feel good or bad after you've done, or there could be another type of approach. Okay? But if good and bad, if what's actually right or wrong depends on the subject, each individual person makes that determination, then what we get is that notions of good and bad, and we're in the critique here, they lack any meaning. It simply becomes an opinion. Good and bad becomes about what we prefer, what we like. And so anyone could be considered moral as long as they live according to their own standards. And that's probably not the way we actually think the way we should determine right or wrong is. Eric Harris, and if some of you are not familiar with that, was one of the shooters in the Columbine school shooting, wrote the following, and this was reported in the Washington Post. My belief is that if I say something, it goes. I am the law, and if you don't like that, you die. If I don't like you or like what you want me to do, you die. So this was posted on his website prior to the school shooting in Columbine. And this is a problem for subjective ethical relativists because they would have to affirm that Eric Harris, if he was doing what he determined to be good, then his actions were moral. And that is something that is going to be, hopefully, that we find very difficult to defend, the concept that he was right in doing those things, that it wasn't wrong for him to do that. Or any other tragic thing that someone does. If they thought it was the right thing to do, then it was the right thing to do. So the criticism of subjective ethical relativism is that morality reduces to an aesthetic tastes about which there can neither be argument nor interpersonal judgment. So if I like vanilla ice cream and you like chocolate ice cream, we can't really argue logically and come to a determination of who's right or who's wrong, because those are just preferences. Are we willing to say that right and wrong are just preferences, what we prefer, and someone else would prefer something else? Well, then we really get ourselves in a tight spot where we can't even criticize things that are clearly wrong. So subjective ethical relativism has some fatal flaws because the concepts of good or bad, right and wrong, end up lacking meaning, and we are unable to criticize people who clearly do bad things, or even praise people who do good things, because what's right or what is wrong is determined by each individual, by whatever reason or standards they choose to use. So subjective ethical relativism is probably not going to support our weight on the ladder. It's not going to be able to do a job for us, so we probably won't be able to hang out there. Well, conventional ethical relativism is the next one. And let's go back to our picture. So here we can see the next rung on the ladder can be conventional ethical relativism. So subjective ethical relativism probably isn't going to hold us. The next one would be conventional ethical relativism. We'll see if that will do. We'll go back to our presentation now. Conventional ethical relativism, there are no objective moral principles. All valid moral principles are made by virtue of their cultural acceptance. So subjective ethical relativism and cultural ethical relativism differ in that instead of with subjective, where an individual determines what's right or wrong, here we have a convention here, or a group of people that determines what's right or wrong. Okay, and so this is, again, very similar to our discussion over truth. Any moral principles we have, if they are valid, they are valid by and because of their cultural acceptance. So rather than individuals determining right or wrong, cultures or groups determine what's right or wrong. So let's look at this example from Poyman's book. In parts of northern Africa, many girls still undergo female circumcision. That is the cutting off of the external genitalia. It's been estimated that 80 million living women have had this surgery, and 4 or 5 million girls suffer it each year. The mutilating surgery often leads to death or sickness and prevents her as a woman from experiencing sexual orgasm. Some African women accept such mutilation as a just sacrifice for marital stability, but many women and ethicists have condemned it as a cruel practice, causing women unjustified pain and mutilation and robbing them of pleasure and autonomy. Some anthropologists, such as Nancy Shepherd Hughes, accept relativism and argue that Westerners have no basis for condemning genital mutilation. Shepherd Hughes advocates tolerance for other cultural values. She writes, "I don't like the idea of clitoridectomies any better than any other woman I know, but I like even less the Western, quote, voices, end quote, of reason, or voices of reason, end quote, imposing their judgments." She argues that judging other cultures irrationally supposes that we know better than the people of that culture do what is right or wrong. We ought to be tolerant of such cultural practices because we have no independent basis for judgment, and who's to judge? So Poyman's discussion here, he brings up the practice of female circumcision, and he says that the position of Shepherd Hughes, of Nancy Shepherd Hughes, is that we should be tolerant of it because we are not in that culture, so how can we know what's right or wrong for that culture? While other people would say, no, objectively, that is something that should not be done. So that's something for us to think about here. Should we or can we say, this is different, being able to say this is right or this is wrong is not the same thing of saying we should intervene or do anything about it. We're simply trying to determine whether or not we can say something like this is a good thing or a bad thing or maybe an indifferent thing. Whether forcing young girls to undergo this practice is acceptable or not, whether it's right or wrong. That has nothing to do with whether we should send an army over to stop it. It's simply trying to determine whether it is right or wrong. So you have many people that say, this is something that should not be done, it's wrong. You have some people like Shepherd Hughes that say, no, we should not intervene, or we're not in a place to even say that it's right or wrong. So look at the quote she has here. "I don't like the idea of the clitoridectomies any better than the other woman I know, but I like even less the Western voices of reason imposing their judgment." So what she likes less than the fact that these happen to these girls is that Westerners say it's wrong. And you have Western voices that say that should not happen. She says she likes that less than the fact that these things happen. So that's very, very interesting for us to look at. This is an example of cultural or ethical relativism, saying that we have no basis, not being part of that culture, to be able to criticize that culture or determine what's right or wrong. Now, Poyman also, in his book, How Should We Live, gives us an argument here from Melville Herkovitz, his argument for ethical relativism. And so here it is. If morality is relative to its culture, then there is no independent basis for criticizing the morality of any other culture but one's own. That would be your first premise. The second premise is that if there is no independent way of criticizing any other culture, then we ought to be tolerant of moralities of other cultures. That's the second premise. The third premise, morality is relative to its culture. And the conclusion, therefore, we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. So let's look at this argument, because this is part of what we are going to be doing this semester, is looking at arguments. The first thing we do is try to determine if the argument is structured properly. So we want to look at we want to analyze the structure of the argument. And it's following the if Q then P, if P then S, Q, therefore P, therefore S. That's the structure of the argument. And this is basically a hypothetical syllogism. So we don't have any problems with the structure, right? Let's look at it. I've color-coded it for us. If morality is relative to culture, then there is no independent basis for criticizing the morality of any other cultures but one's own. That's if Q, then P. And then, building on that, if P, restating of P here, if there is no independent way of criticizing any other culture, then S, then we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. We have no problem with the logic. Then there's the affirmation of Q, morality is relative to culture. And since we're affirming Q here, then we're concluding P. And then we're concluding S. So since Q is true, then P is true, and since P is true, then S is true. Okay? So, therefore, we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of the other cultures. So the logic of the structure is fine. Okay? Now let's look at the truth value of the premises and see if everything fits together. So we have a couple of claims that, one, morality is relative to its culture. P, that's Q. Q, morality is relative to culture. P, there is no independent way of criticizing any other culture. And S, we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. So is Q true? Well, it might be true if it is the fact that morality is relative to culture. Certainly we say cultures have different moral standards. Okay, but now whether right or wrong is the case there, then, but we can accept that just for sake of argument. We could say, if Q is true, then maybe, what we could say, we could accept for sake of argument that Q is true without actually making a determination. But assume that Q is true, then let's look at P. There is no independent way of criticizing any other culture. So if morality is independent relative to culture, then there's not an independent way of criticizing any culture. So if Q is true, then P would be true, right? And so that those two are fit. So that seems to fit together. What about S? We ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. Okay? So we ask the question, is Q true? Well, we can maybe argue it, but for sake of argument, let's say yes. And then is P true? Well, if Q is true, then P is true. Okay. Now, does P follow from Q? Yes. But does S follow from P? If P is true, is the right thing or the true thing is that we ought to be tolerant of moralities of other cultures. Even if we have no way to criticize them, should we be tolerant? Okay? And that's a question some of you may think, well, yes, we should. And some of you may say, well, no, we shouldn't. Well, think about that for a moment. If there's no independent way to criticize another culture, should we be tolerant of the moralities of those cultures? Well, you can certainly put your thoughts in the discussion board for this class, and we'll be glad to go through it there. But let's look along, and let's look at some reasons why S may not follow from P. This would not apply to societies that did not view tolerance as a moral virtue. So, if you had two societies, Society A, and Society A believes tolerance is a moral virtue, so they would accept that. But you have Society B that has a different moral virtue, and one of those moral virtues is that they should destroy Society A. Then you have to ask the question, does Society A have to respect Society B's morality and not try to oppose their own destruction? Now this can get a little bit confusing, but if you have a group, let's call them it's A. A believes that tolerance is a virtue. So the right thing for them to do is to tolerate other societies and their morals, because after all, they don't have a position to judge. And you have a neighboring society that says, what is the right thing to do for us is to destroy the people who live in A. Genocide. Destroy them completely. Should Society A then say, well, we can't say that B is wrong, so we should not defend ourselves. We ought to tolerate their view and not oppose it. In other words, we should not keep ourselves from being killed or being destroyed. Does that make sense? Probably we're going to say, no, that doesn't make sense. So this is one of the problems with this concept or this argument, or the idea that saying that Proposition S, we ought to be tolerant of moralities of other cultures, actually flows from the idea that we may not be able to criticize cultures. Because if you hold that and you have this situation where you have one group that wants to destroy the other group, you would say it would be immoral for Society A to defend themselves, and it would be moral for Society B to destroy Society A. And that gets to be a little bit absurd there. So, to say that Society A would be immoral in trying to keep themselves from being destroyed by Society B is what you would be forced into as a cultural or a conventional ethical relativist, and according to this proposition here of S entailed from P. But what if somebody says, well, tolerance is actually a virtue that every society ought to hold to, that it's cross-culturally independent, okay? In other words, that every society ought to be tolerant regardless of where they are in time, place, and people. Well, if you take that view, then tolerance becomes a hyper virtue, right? So it applies to everybody, and that's simply then an absolute moral principle or a universal moral principle. If you do that, then morality is relative to culture would be false. If you say every culture should be tolerant, then you're saying tolerance is a meta virtue or a absolute value or moral principle, and then your whole argument about morality being relative is shot. So you can't save this argument by saying that tolerance should be a hyper virtue. A couple other of implications of conventionalism is that reformers are always wrong. So let's consider the time in America's history where we had slavery. And you had some people in that society who claimed we should not have slavery. Well, according to cultural ethical relativism, slavery was moral at the time because it was accepted by the society. And according to cultural ethical relativism, or conventional ethical relativism, those who were the abolitionists were wrong, morally wrong, to claim that you should not have slavery because they differed from their culture. So, reformers are always wrong. So someone like anyone who is saying that we should change and get better is morally wrong because they are outside of the norm of their society, because society determines what's right or wrong. With conventional ethical relativism, you can't have progress towards something that is ultimately better, because the only way that you determine whether something is good or bad is how it relates to the society itself. So, you can't say that pre-Civil War America's society, which was filled with slavery and all other kinds of things, is worse than society today in America, or society in any other culture at any other time. All you can say is that they are different, because you don't have an objective standard to measure any kind of progress against. So that's a big problem. So the abolitionists, if conventional ethical relativism is true, abolitionists pre-Civil War, pre-freedom, before the slaves were freed in America, would have been morally wrong to oppose slavery because that was the cultural convention of that time. Okay, so that's probably a position we wouldn't like. So that may be a good reason not to affirm conventional ethical relativism. Another thing that causes a problem here, for conventional ethical relativism, is determining what size group is large enough, and what prevents conventional ethical relativism from collapsing into subjective ethical relativism. So we might say that United States is, we're 300 plus million people. That's big enough to have a culture. Well, what about 100 million people? That's probably big enough as well. Well, what about 1 million people? Maybe that's big enough. What about 1,000 people? That might even be big enough. What about 100 people? Well, maybe we're getting close now. Let's say maybe, 100 people sounds, kind of close. Maybe we'll go with it. What about 99? What's the difference between 99 and 100? And then what's the difference between 98 and 99? If we say that, 99 is okay because it's only one different from 100. And then what's wrong with 98? It's only one different from 99. The only place you can stop conventionalism logically from collapsing into subjective ethical relativism is when you go from one person to two. So you have a difference when you have more than one person and when you only have one person. One person is subjective ethical relativism. If you have two people, you could say maybe you could have a culture. Okay? But then you can ask the question of, does one person who is part of a culture dying mean the culture no longer exists, or could it survive in the remaining members? And we probably would have to say, people die all the time and cultures don't just disappear because somebody dies. So if you have a culture of two people and one person in that culture dies, now you're left with a culture of one, which is subjective ethical relativism. So conventional ethical relativism ends up collapsing into subjective ethical relativism, and there's really no way to get around that. So that's another criticism of conventional ethical relativism, is it has its own problems, plus it has all the problems that we saw with subjective ethical relativism. So what about ethical objectivism? That's our next approach. Now, what I'm going to do here is just kind of go through these questions. I usually take a long time to go through these questions. We have a lot of discussion. But for the sake of the video, it won't work well in the video. So I'm just going to try to answer these pretty quickly for us and give us some reasons why we might, how we might answer these questions. Now, in a classroom setting, this is good because we'll probably find as we go along that we have some disagreement about right or wrong on these questions. So the first one is, why do you dislike being lied to? And generally, we dislike being lied to because we make plans off of information. We expect to have good information, and we expect that if we have good information, we make better plans. If I'm lied to, then I have bad information, and then my plans don't work out as well as they should, and I end up losing time or money or something like that. So it's ultimately a loss of our ability to express ourselves and to have our own autonomy. So when we're lied to, we have bad information to make judgments in the world, and it hurts our ability to make judgments or hurts our autonomy. The next question is, why do you value truth? And that's really the same kind of question there. It's the valuing truth is the same reason we dislike being lied to. It diminishes our ability to make, being lied to diminishes our ability to make autonomous judgments. Having more truth, we think, would increase our ability to make good decisions or increase our autonomy. So those two kind of are related. The next question, do you approve of breaking a promise or contract? Probably there we're going to say, no, if you make a promise, you should keep it. If you have a contract, which is simply a promise that's formalized, right, and perhaps legally binding, then you should keep your promise. Now we might say, you should keep your promise if you can, or you should make every effort to keep your promise. But we know that sometimes you can't, no matter how much you want to. So we would say we'd approve of it Probably not, but we understand there are situations when sometimes it's impossible to keep, or when sometimes you can't keep it. But you should keep them if you can. Okay? Fourth question, why don't you like it when someone steals your property? Well, someone steals our property, it's our stuff, and most of the time we've traded our time or our money, we've traded our time to either get money or to get that stuff. And so if I've traded hours of my time to earn money, and then I used money to buy stuff, and somebody steals my stuff, it's like they've stolen some of my life. They've stolen money, which I traded time and effort, my life, for that money, and now they've taken that thing from me, so it's like they're stealing a portion of your life. So that diminishes our autonomy again. When the breaking of the contract also has issues with that, because if I am told a promise, if someone makes a promise, then I will make decisions off of that. If they break that promise, then that can affect my ability to do my decisions, right? All right, next one. Do you approve of cheating or fraud? Well, cheating is similar to stealing. Fraud is similar to stealing, right? And we hopefully say no. And hopefully we don't approve of cheating. And I want to say you have some really self-interested reasons to not let people cheat. Because if you let people cheat, it actually diminishes the value of your degree. If you let people cheat on you here at the college, it diminishes the value of your degree. Because more people have a degree they shouldn't have without earning it, which means that you'll earn less money based with your degree because there will be more of those degrees available. So those are some reasons we don't like cheating or fraud. Fraud. Why is murder wrong? And if we talk about reducing our autonomy and your diminishing of the value of your degree would reduce your autonomy in the previous question, murder would be the ultimate taking of anybody's ability to make choices and to be autonomous, right? It's stopping it completely. So that would be one of the reasons why murder would be wrong. Why is child abuse wrong? We can get on the autonomy thing again, because child abuse can cause long-term problems that hinder development and growth. And so it would be wrong because it prevents someone from being able to be all that they can be. And it limits their autonomy. Okay? Next question, is it permissible to discriminate on the basis of sex or gender? And often when I ask this question, immediately everybody says, no, you should not discriminate at all. So then I ask a follow-up question. Well, what if, suppose that we are hiring a person to counsel women who have been violently raped by men. And if we decide in the process that we want a woman to fill this role, because women would maybe feel these women would be perhaps traumatized or threatened by having a man give them counseling over after they have experienced this horrible thing. Is that wrong? Some people still say yes, it is wrong, and other people would say no, that actually makes good sense. We've also had discussions in recent years about people of certain races policing in communities of certain races. And then that claim or that call for community-based policing, that would be the same people of the same race being the police in the communities of the same race, would also be making a discrimination based on race. And that says sex or gender. It should be race or gender. I apologize. That question should be race or gender. So, if we say then that it is always wrong to discriminate on the basis of sex or race or gender, then we'd have to say, look, the counseling idea, that's wrong, and those groups who happen to be calling for community-based policing are also wrong. So, again, we can get now we start getting into some questions where we may get some disagreement if we were in a classroom setting. Why is it good to why is it correct to return good for good and not evil for good? In other words, why is the right thing to do if someone's been good to you, for you to be good to them rather than to be evil to them? And you might say, well, then because if you are good to someone when they are good, then that promotes being more good. And if you are evil to someone when they do good, then that would be a disincentive for someone to be good. If they expect that, if you do something nice, they're going to get punched in the face, then they may not do something nice. Okay, so that could be a reason. The next question, is it permissible to execute people who are innocent of murder? This is an interesting question. So this is not saying, can you just execute someone for something, for anything, or should you execute people for murder? The question is it permissible to execute people who have not committed murder? Maybe they've committed another crime. And so some people may say, no, murder is the only crime that should have execution, but in our country, treason can be a crime that is acceptable to, or the punishment can be execution. In other places, there are other crimes short of murder. Some people have called for those who abuse children to be executed. So we could have some differences of opinion. You could have some people say that even murder is it's impermissible, or it's wrong to execute someone even if they did murder another person. All right, the next question is suicide ever permissible? Is it ever allowable? We can have some different views on this. Some people will say, yes, you should not interfere with people, and if that's what they choose to do, you should not stop them. Others will say that you should make every effort to stop that, so that it's never allowable, regardless of the condition. So you can have a spectrum of answers there. Again, these questions usually take about 2 hours to go through in a classroom discussion. We would have a lot of discussion with this, but we're going through them quickly here. So I invite you to kind of think about these questions for a little bit when we're done. We've got a few more. Is voluntary euthanasia ever morally permissible? That's very similar to the other question about suicide. Is it ever okay to have someone voluntarily euthanized? We'll probably get some very similar responses there. The next question, is abortion ever morally permissible? Well, certainly we can get some heated debates over this. Some will say yes, some will say no, some will say under some circumstances. The next question, is premarital sex morally permissible? Usually I have a resounding yes for this question in the classroom. So the idea is that people can do what they want to do, and you shouldn't oppose that. Others will say, no, it's wrong, and they may have a health or religious-based reason for that. And then I ask the next question, is it permissible to have more than one spouse? And usually I get an equally loud no to this question. So the question here is, what about cultures that do have other more than one spouse? So we're talking about morally permissible. We're not talking about whether it's a good idea, smart thing to do. But we're asking whether people should be allowed to do that if they want to. And so you can have various responses to that. The next question, are homosexual relations morally permissible? And in this, often we get very many people who say, similar to the premarital sex, that sexuality and that is simply a personal issue, and it's not something that has a moral connotation to it. Then we do have some that would say no to that, and usually those would be based off of perhaps religious or philosophical arguments for that. The next question, is it morally permissible to major in economics in college? And a lot of people are curious about that. Usually we have some people that don't understand. And then I go on to the next question. Is it wrong to eat with your fork in your right hand instead of your left hand? And hopefully you can see, if we were asking these questions and you could not see the slides and you didn't know what the questions were and we're just talking about them, that we would have some good discussions over this. And these two questions about economics and which fork you eat are really not ethical questions. They may have some customs, or they may just be about our own choices, but they are not ethical questions in the way that the previous questions were. And then at the end we get, is it wrong to eat animals? And now we get into the extension of ethics beyond humanity. So these questions, I want you to just sit and think about them for a little bit. I've kind of gone through some ways that we might answer these questions, ways that my students in the past have answered these questions. I think they're good for us to consider because it helps us to try to figure out why something is wrong, not just whether it is wrong or not, or why something is right, not just whether it is right or not. So that's important for us to get our heads around. So since we have determined that ethical relativism is untenable, since it doesn't seem to work, we seem to be left with only two options. Either ethical objectivism is true or ethical nihilism is true. The remainder of this course will be a search for an acceptable basis to have an objective ethics. If we can't find an acceptable basis for an objective ethics, we'll be left with ethical nihilism. So that's what we're going to do for the rest of this semester, is we're going to try to figure out if we can find a rung on this ladder that will hold us up out of the pit. Okay, so we've got two that we've looked at that are not going to work. Seem to have some logical problems with them. So hopefully we can find something in ethical objectivism that will work. Otherwise, we're all going to have to admit that we are nihilists. Okay? So, I'm going to stop this video here, and then I will resume with a second video where we will continue through natural law.